Hi, my name is Cecilia Puna, and welcome to this episode of Brave New Women. All around the world, there are amazing, ordinary women doing extraordinary things. Brave New Women is about giving those women a platform and a voice, and it's about changing the way that women are perceived. And it's a way of inspiring all of us to do the things that we've always wanted to do. I'm absolutely delighted today to be speaking to Elisabeth Fahrni Mansur. Elisabeth is the Senior Manager of the Marine Conservation Program for the Wildlife Conservation Society in Bangladesh. And her main focus is protecting the threatened marine megafauna and also working on science-based solutions for a healthy ocean, supporting healthy people. So welcome, Elisabeth.
Thank you so much for having me.
Elisabeth, you've made some big changes in your life. So you started your life in Switzerland and you started your professional life as a primary school teacher. And now you're working in conservation in Bangladesh. So how did that happen?
Long story. I think change is so much a part of our life, especially now when we are more mobile and we have opportunities to travel and visit other countries. I had the great fortune of having parents who always supported my visiting different places around the world. And I fell in love in Bangladesh with my now husband, also with the people that are very hospitable here. And the environment, especially the largest mangrove forest, the Sundarban, where I started my work in conservation together with my husband.
So did you have an interest in conservation before you came to Bangladesh? Was that something that started in Bangladesh?
Well, it wasn't a formal interest, but I was privileged to grow up in rural Switzerland. We lived right next to a forest with open fields around us. And I always enjoyed being outside. I was always interested in the environment, in wildlife. And so it was kind of a gradual growing from teaching and waking the inherent interest in children to following through on that and building up environmental consciousness and bringing my experience from the educational sector into conservation, particularly in communicating conservation science and helping it to actually turn into action on the ground. And I have found that Bangladesh has an enormous capacity and just incredibly many opportunities. And so it's been a fortunate kind of place for me to work and to live in, because these opportunities are very encouraging to move forward. And having success also motivates next steps. And that's how the conservation world that I am lucky enough to be working in has evolved.
When you say many opportunities in conservation, or what were you referring to particularly?
I think in general, people have an enormous entrepreneur spirit, just because the population is incredibly adaptable and also very resilient to various factors. But I do think specifically in conservation, we're really in a conservation hotspot here. The biodiversity of Bangladesh is incredible on land, in the air, and in the water. We've got tigers in the mangrove. We've got elephants in the hilly areas. We've got a lot of small cats. We've got just incredibly many iconic and also lesser known species.
Mm-hmm. And what is the particular focus of your work in Bangladesh?
So when I started working as a tour guide in the Sundarban forest, we quickly realized and also helped establish terrestrial conservation work. And that is work in the forests that works with species that are more visible because they are there or their tracks are there. But we also realized, my husband and I, that there was less of a focus on aquatic ecosystems. And we had the great luck of having a mentor from the Wildlife Conservation Society, Brian Smith, who really pioneered freshwater dolphin research and conservation in this region. And he was really the guiding direction in building a program around protecting threatened freshwater dolphin species, and then also widening our horizon and our scope to look at the marine cetaceans, so dolphins, whales, and porpoises, and later on sharks, rays, and marine turtles. The reason why we focus on this larger group called marine megafauna is because they are all facing the similar threats, the pressures from overfishing or being bycaught. And so the efforts that we look at when we're identifying these flagship species also have an impact on sustainable fisheries and on fishing livelihoods.
Mm-hmm. And so a marine protected area has recently been created. Can you tell me about that?
So different pressures require different solutions, and conservation has to be a very holistic approach. So one way of protecting wildlife and the ecosystems that they maintain, that they help us keep healthy, is by protecting the areas or habitats that they use, especially those that they use in critical stages of their lives. So nursery grounds or pupping areas, migratory routes, things like that. So our research has focused very much on identifying these areas where conservation action would have the largest impact on protecting populations. And that is where the MPAs are. Today, we have 3 MPAs in Bangladesh, and WCS has been key in facilitating the declaration of these MPAs. They are an important tool for protecting critical marine habitat.
And what does it take to have a marine protected area created?
Well, actually, that's probably the easy part and also the fun part, because you do the research. So it's basically our homework to identify these places, to define spatial planning within these areas on what management should take place there. And going with those plans to the government, going with those plans to local stakeholders, a lot of discussions with communities that are dependent on the resources or use them extensively to find the best solution that balances the protection of threatened marine wildlife and also can sustain fisheries livelihood and the national blue economy. So the establishment is fairly easy. It also helps that it is an international commitment to put more, larger portions of the exclusive economic zone under protection. So that is certainly a driver for the government to improve protection and declare MPAs. The really tough part comes after that, and that is the actual implementation. And that is actually the part that I focus on quite strongly now. So getting the different stakeholders to come together to find locally suitable ways in which the MPA can be enforced and in which we can increase compliance so that the objectives of the MPAs can be met.
How do you go about that?
Well, there's different ways of doing that. So one is certainly the law enforcement aspect of it, to make sure that there are eyes on the water. In the marine areas for Bangladesh, that is quite a new thing that needs to be introduced, because the 2 government agencies that are responsible for protecting marine areas, the Department of Forest and the Department of Fisheries, both do not have the capacity to actually be out on the water. However, they have a great willingness to collaborate with the agencies that are out there, so the Bangladesh Navy and Coast Guard. And we're now working towards using systematic monitoring and enforcement patrols, establishing those using a smart software which guides patrols and allows patrolling reports to be used for planning the next patrols. We're working on introducing that. Then also, of course, we work with the fishermen that are in those areas, active in those areas, and that includes helping them to know where the area is, to know what the regulations are that apply, to safely release marine wildlife that is protected and gets entangled in their gear. And then also looking at infrastructure changes or technological solutions. So finding innovative ways in which these MPAs can benefit their livelihoods, increase their at-sea safety, and overall make sure that we still have enough fish for future generations.
What has been the reaction of the local fishermen?
We have a very large coastline, a long coastline, and some of the MPAs are quite far away from the coast, and others are very close around the islands or the fishing grounds. And so the reactions are a little bit difficult or different. Some fishermen are very, very keen to have stricter regulations enforced and enforced fairly. That is the main emphasis. They feel especially artisanal fisheries, so small-scale fishermen feel very much underrepresented because the industrial fisheries is very powerful and strong. And so working with the different fishing communities on actually communicating the regulations, defining them, and then ensuring compliance. And then there's also people that are that first need to understand the spatial protection concept. So that's where we work strongly with educational outreach. We have these great mobile exhibitions that travel from one place to the other and have gamified our communication. So putting regulations and rules and protective measures into games so that people are engaged with our interpreters and can discuss the benefits, the use, and the application of MPA regulations.
Mm-hmm. And what is the state of the these megafauna at the moment? How bad is the problem?
Well, it differs between species groups, but the basis of it is we're taking out too much. And these species, all the megafauna species reproduce very, very slowly. Many of them do not have young until they are 10 or 15 years old. And when they have young, they have only 1 or 2 pups every 1 or 2 years. So actually very similar to humans. I mean, cetaceans are mammals and they have life histories similar to ours, but also a lot of the sharks and rays, which is less known, have very similar very, very low reproductive rates and long life histories. So they are inherently prone to overfishing, to be bycaught. And that is a great problem because their populations just cannot recover fast enough. And their role that they play in the ecosystem as top predators in maintaining the balance within the habitats that they occupy is really critical. And that's why they are the flagship species that we need to focus on protecting that will secure the ecosystem health. It's quite interesting, from a biological, ecological point of view, for many of the species, we don't actually understand their niches and their overall benefits or their holistic benefits to the system. But we do know without them, we're going to be in deep trouble.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the other big conservation issues in Bangladesh?
Well, for cetaceans, I think we are in a really good position because dolphins and porpoises are considered as unique animals, and fishermen do not purposefully kill them or catch them in their nets. They do try to release them. They're very keen on doing that. But for sharks and rays, there is very high demand for their parts, both for domestic consumption, but also in the international market. And the price for these, say, shark and ray fins, for the mobulid ray gill plates, but also for their meat, for their skins, is so high that fishers retain all of them when they are caught. And, this has led, we have had a 71% decline overall globally in overall shark and ray populations over the last 50 years. And that is a decline that is really, really alarming. And if we don't react now, it will be too late.
71%. Wow. 71% in 50 years.
Yes. Very worrisome. And many of these critically endangered or vulnerable species are actually present in Bangladesh because we have such an amazing position with this huge freshwater inflow from the large delta, the Ganges, Brahmaputra and Meghna delta. And then we have a deep sea canyon just off the coast of the world's largest mangrove forest. So that brings deep, cold, upwelling water to the surface. And this whole mix of nutrient-rich water is also circulated by the currents. So it's an incredibly productive area and is used by many species throughout their life cycles.
So if these areas are protected, it'll have an effect not only here, but in fact, a much larger effect than just in the Bangladeshi waters.
Absolutely. I mean, when we do look at spatial protection, we need to remember that many of these species, while they have a preference for certain habitat types, also are highly mobile. So, an MPA is a demarcated space where protection is implemented. That protection ranges from no fishing at all to only selective gear. That is, different regulations for different areas. But it is, of course, spatially restricted, and the animals don't stay in there. But the areas in our waters that have been identified have the highest number of animals throughout the year. So they're really, there's robust science behind that, extensive time spent at sea investigating this, working with citizen science fishermen who are out at sea when we cannot during the stormy season, and help us by providing information that's critical because it is geospatial information, where they make catches of what species. And it's a really beautiful system because in return for giving us this critical information, they receive a GPS that helps them stay safer at sea. So they can navigate more efficiently and safely. So it's a win-win situation for fishermen, for conservation, and overall for fisheries in Bangladesh.
And what would be a typical day for you?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I'm not sure I have a typical day. I work mostly in the policy level things, but also have a lot of work in writing the results and communicating results from our research. I help manage my program, the WCS program, but specifically the marine program. So, it's more working together with an incredibly talented and very passionate team to actually bring conservation changes that we want to see and need to see. So I have the privilege of working with wonderful government partners who are keen to bring about the necessary changes. We are very engaged with fishing communities. So I think my typical day is more administrative than I would like it to be, but my favorite days are those spent out either in the fishing communities, at landing sites, or out on the water in the Bay of Bengal.
Mm-hmm. And how has been, a couple of questions about, how has been the transition from living in Switzerland to living in Bangladesh? How have you found that?
Well, now having lived here for almost 20 years, it's more like going on a holiday when we go to Switzerland. And, I think there are so many similarities because people are people. We all have the same desires and requirements. But I do think from a cultural point of view, there are a lot of things in Switzerland that I would have difficulty going back to. I find that things are extremely well structured and highly functional. But that also doesn't leave a whole lot of space for the creativity or the innovation to look beyond what people are told to do or to think. And I think that is something that I greatly value in Bangladesh, that we have that freedom to try out things, to discuss solutions, to come up with locally developed ideas. And if they don't work, you pick it up somewhere else. And that if they do work, then the impacts are amplified, because we're talking about 180 million people compared to 8 million people. So the impact and the scale of things are also very different here.
I mean, I traveled in India for 10 weeks when I left university. And what really shocked me when I went back to Australia was just the consumerism and the plastic and when you go into supermarkets in Australia, there's just, 10 different types of shampoo. And it's just all this, well, what do you need all this stuff for? It really shocked me going back to Australia.
Yeah. I think that, again, is something that comes down really to personal decisions. Of course, each country has different regulations and has different social norms of how to do things. In general, people strive for the economic development that is inherently connected to choices. But I do think also that in a country that is growing stronger economically, we still have the benefits of we often don't have as much overwhelming choice. Let's say, as an example, the health system, delivering my children here in Bangladesh, I didn't have the option of, certain things or certain tests being done. So I didn't have to worry about it. And of course, I'm lucky because I got the help I needed, and I, had easy deliveries. But I think that pressures that we often build up in more developed countries can actually have negative impacts also on our health and our well-being. But not saying that, development is inherent with all countries. Every nation, every society is developing and evolving. I do think I hope overall that we move as a whole people more towards reconnecting to the environment and really valuing the services that nature provides and that we depend on. So that is a inherent hope. It has to do with consumerism that they're personal choices, but I do hope as a people we can make better ones.
When you look back over the last 20 years, how have you changed?
Oh, so many ways. So if I look at it from a more philosophical point of view, I think I've become more hopeful. In terms of the working environment that I am in here, I'm seeing so many bright young people coming along that have the capacity and the interest to pursue innovative and sustainable approaches to a huge variety of problems or challenges. And I think we are getting better at harnessing that enormous potential, and also connecting those potentials of different people together and pointing it towards areas where we have to find solutions fast. I do think that, working in an organization where we've now in Bangladesh been able to provide jobs and employment where that was very limited before, also draws more motivation to engage in a field that is not socially as highly regarded as working in a government job or in a bank or in, communications. So that's a big change that I see. I take great pride in a growing conservation movement and professional development among those that are really interested and keen in pursuing this career.
Mm-hmm. And as a woman, has that been a negative, a positive, or has that had any impact at all?
it definitely has an impact, and perhaps not only as being a woman, but being who I am and how I work and tend to look at things, or tend to try to solve problems. I think inherently we have the urge to do things in a social manner, in an inclusive manner, and historically that has not been the case in many aspects of society, be it in governance, being it in decision making, or being it in natural resource use. So I think being a woman and being aware of how this society that I'm living in and a part of makes it quite difficult for women to take public posts and to take leadership positions and to express themselves in a way that is actually heard. I think it does make a difference. I would say it's a positive one, because I can also mentor and support a lot of incredibly bright women that have huge potential and will be the future leaders, be it in conservation, be it in sustainable natural resource use, or in the governance systems that manage these.
Well, the last question I like to ask is if you had a message for people who are listening, or if there's anything that we've missed, or anything that you wanted to add, what would that be?
Well, I really like the title of your podcast, Brave New Women. So first of all, I'm not a new woman, but I do think that bravery is really something that we need to put out there, and we need to encourage women and their societies, their families that they live in, to be brave in a sense that not let ourselves be inhibited by perceived barriers, but actually pushing those and questioning norms and thinking out of the box, using our critical thinking skills, developing those, and then working together, being brave enough to forge partnerships that are beneficial not only for ourselves, but also for our the societies that we live in, and obviously for the environment that we depend on.
Mm-hmm. Well, Elisabeth, I think that you have been brave in so many different ways, and such an inspiration for other people. I think that the work you're doing in Bangladesh is just fantastic and so important. So thank you for that. And thank you very much.
I'm going to pass those thanks on to my team. I have an incredibly supportive family here. I have got a wonderful local team, and the international WCS family is incredibly supportive, enabling us to achieve what we are achieving and continuing to work for improvements.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that you have a very key role to play in that. So thank you for being on the podcast. It's been fascinating.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Brave New Women. Certain podcast sites such as Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or Podchaser let you leave a rating and a review. The more ratings and reviews we get, the more people will listen, and the more these women's stories will be shared. So I'd really appreciate it if you could. Thanks for listening.